On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in a devastating surprise attack that brought America into World War II. The architect of this audacious operation was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The attack was tactically brilliant, strategically bold, and ultimately, in Yamamoto's own estimation, a terrible mistake that would lead Japan to catastrophic defeat. Unlike many of his contemporaries in the Japanese military establishment, Yamamoto possessed an unusually clear-eyed understanding of what war with America would mean. He had seen American industrial power firsthand. He understood the national character and resolve of the American people, and he knew with near certainty that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict against such an adversary. This is the story of why Yamamoto knew Japan couldn't win a long war, how he tried to warn his government, why his warnings were ignored, and how he was forced to implement a strategy he believed was doomed to failure. Isoroku Yamamoto was born Isoroku Takano on April 4, 1884, in Nagaoka, a city in Niigata Prefecture on the northwestern coast of Honshu, Japan's main island. He came from a samurai family that had fallen on hard times following the Meiji Restoration, when the feudal system was abolished and the samurai class lost its privileges. His father, Sadayoshi Takano, was 56 years old when Isoroku was born, and the name Isoroku literally means 56 in Japanese, commemorating his father's age. Young Isoroku grew up in modest circumstances, but received a good education. He was an excellent student with a particular aptitude for mathematics and strategic games like shogi, Japanese chess. In 1901, at the age of 16, he passed the entrance examination for the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima, beginning a naval career that would span 4 decades and end only with his death in combat. Yamamoto graduated from the Naval Academy in 1904, ranking 7th in his class of 191 cadets. His timing was fortuitous, as Japan was then engaged in the Russo-Japanese War, the first major conflict in which an Asian power defeated a European one. As a young ensign aboard the cruiser Nishin, Yamamoto participated in the Battle of Tsushima in May 1905, one of the most decisive naval engagements in history. During this battle, the Japanese fleet under Admiral Heihachiro Togo annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet, demonstrating the effectiveness of modern naval tactics and the importance of naval aviation reconnaissance. It was at Tsushima that Yamamoto received his first wound in combat, losing 2 fingers on his left hand when a shell exploded near his station. This injury earned him the nickname 80 sen, as a manicure in Japan at that time cost 10 sen per finger. The battle made a profound impression on the young officer, teaching him both the possibilities and limitations of naval warfare. After the war, Yamamoto continued his education and rose through the ranks. In 1913, he was adopted into the Yamamoto family, a common practice in Japan for families without male heirs, and took their surname. He attended the Naval Staff College and became increasingly interested in the emerging field of naval aviation, recognizing early on that aircraft would revolutionize naval warfare. But the most formative experience of Yamamoto's early career came in 1919, when he was sent to the United States to study at Harvard University. This assignment would prove crucial in shaping his understanding of America and his later strategic assessments. Yamamoto spent 2 years at Harvard, from 1919 to 1921, studying economics and the American oil industry. He lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, traveled extensively throughout the United States, and immersed himself in American culture. He learned to speak English fluently, played bridge with American friends, and developed a deep appreciation for American society. During his time in America, Yamamoto was struck by several things that would inform his later strategic thinking. First was the sheer scale of American industry. He visited factories, oil refineries, and automobile plants, witnessing firsthand the productive capacity of American manufacturing. He saw the vast natural resources available to the United States: iron ore from the Great Lakes region, oil from Texas and California, coal from Appalachia, and agricultural abundance from the Great Plains. He recognized that America's industrial output dwarfed Japan's, and that this gap would only widen in the event of war. Second, Yamamoto observed the American national character. He was impressed by American optimism, ingenuity, and work ethic. He noted the country's cultural diversity and its ability to assimilate immigrants into a cohesive national identity. He also recognized that Americans, while initially reluctant to enter foreign conflicts, became formidable opponents once aroused, as demonstrated in World War I. The combination of industrial might and national resolve convinced Yamamoto that America would be a dangerous enemy. Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1921 and resumed his naval career with a new perspective that set him apart from many of his colleagues. He served a second tour in the United States from 1925 to 1927, this time as naval attaché at the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C. During this period, he witnessed the continued expansion of American industrial capacity and the growing sophistication of American naval aviation. He became convinced that aircraft carriers, not battleships, would be the decisive weapons in future naval conflicts, a view considered radical by many conservative naval officers who still believed in the supremacy of the big-gun battleship. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Yamamoto championed naval aviation within the Japanese Navy. He commanded the aircraft carrier Akagi, served as head of the Navy's technical division, and later became chief of the Naval Aviation Department. He pushed for the development of long-range aircraft and trained pilots to operate from carriers. His vision of carrier-based aviation as the future of naval warfare would be vindicated at Pearl Harbor, though not in the way he hoped. By the mid-1930s, Japan was on a collision course with the Western powers. The country had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and withdrawn from the League of Nations in 1933. Militarists increasingly dominated Japanese politics, advocating for territorial expansion to secure resources and establish a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere under Japanese leadership. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, beginning the Second Sino-Japanese War, which would eventually merge with World War II. Yamamoto opposed many of these aggressive policies, particularly the idea of war with the United States. His opposition was not based on pacifism or moral objections to imperialism, but on hard-headed strategic calculation. He understood Japan's vulnerabilities and America's strengths in a way that many of his more nationalistic colleagues did not. His views made him unpopular with ultranationalists and militarists, some of whom threatened his life. In 1939, partly to protect him from assassination, the Navy appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, a position that kept him at sea and away from the political intrigues of Tokyo. As Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Yamamoto found himself in an impossible position. Relations between Japan and the United States deteriorated throughout 1940 and 1941. Japan's alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy through the Tripartite Pact, its occupation of French Indochina, and its continued aggression in China prompted the United States to impose increasingly severe economic sanctions. In July 1941, the U.S. froze Japanese assets and, most critically, imposed an oil embargo. This embargo was an existential threat to Japan. The country imported 80% of its oil, most of it from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. Without oil, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt within months. The military stockpiles would sustain operations for perhaps a year or two at most. Faced with this crisis, Japanese leaders saw two options: back down and withdraw from China and Indochina, accepting a humiliating diplomatic defeat, or go to war to seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, particularly the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The militarists chose war. Yamamoto vehemently opposed war with the United States. In meetings with government officials and in private conversations with colleagues, he repeatedly warned that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict against America. His most famous statement on the subject came in a letter to a prominent politician in which he wrote, "If ordered to fight, I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years. This quote is often paraphrased as I can run wild for 6 months. After that I have no expectation of success. But the meaning is clear. Yamamoto believed Japan might achieve early tactical victories, but would inevitably lose a long war. He elaborated on this view in various communications. He pointed out that America's industrial capacity was at least 10 times greater than Japan's, and in a prolonged conflict, industrial production would determine the outcome. He noted that America could replace losses in ships, aircraft, and trained personnel far more quickly than Japan. He warned that the American people, once committed to war, would not accept a negotiated peace, but would fight until Japan was completely defeated. To understand why Yamamoto was so certain Japan would lose, we need to examine the stark disparities between the two nations in 1941. In terms of raw industrial output, the United States produced approximately 10 times more steel than Japan, and steel was the foundation of military production. In 1941, American steel production was about 75 million tons compared to Japan's 7 million tons. The gap in other crucial resources was even wider. The United States produced about 180 million tons of crude oil annually, while Japan produced virtually none, relying entirely on imports. The US had about 185 million people compared to Japan's 73 million, providing a much larger pool for military recruitment. Perhaps most tellingly, the American economy was about 7 to 10 times larger than Japan's, depending on how it was measured. The United States had a GDP of approximately $1 trillion in 1941 dollars, while Japan's was around $100 $950 billion. This meant America could devote a much larger absolute amount to war production even while maintaining higher civilian living standards. The technological and industrial gap extended to all aspects of warfare. American shipyards had the capacity to build multiple aircraft carriers, battleships, and hundreds of other vessels simultaneously. The Japanese Navy, while possessing some of the world's finest warships in 1941, could not replace losses at anywhere near the American rate. In aviation, American factories could produce tens of thousands of aircraft per year, while Japanese production was measured in thousands. By 1944, the United States was producing more than 96,000 aircraft annually, compared to Japan's peak production of about 28,000. American pilot training programs could process thousands of aviators through comprehensive training courses, while Japanese programs, though initially producing superbly trained pilots, could not maintain quality or quantity as the war progressed. The same disparity existed in every category: tanks, trucks, artillery, small arms, ammunition, and all the logistical infrastructure needed to support modern warfare. Yamamoto, with his experience in America and his understanding of economics, grasped these realities even if many of his colleagues chose to ignore them. Beyond material factors, Yamamoto understood the psychological and cultural dimensions of fighting America. He knew that Americans valued individual liberty and initially opposed foreign entanglements, but once committed to a cause, they pursued it with determination and resources that few other nations could match. He had witnessed American mobilization in World War I and understood that a surprise attack like Pearl Harbor would not demoralize America into seeking peace, but would instead unite the country in a fury of retribution. He supposedly told colleagues that attacking Pearl Harbor would awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve, though the authenticity of this quote is disputed. Whether or not he used those exact words, the sentiment accurately reflected his thinking. Yamamoto believed that Japan's only hope in a war with the United States was to achieve such spectacular early victories that America would agree to a negotiated peace, rather than wage a long, costly war. This strategy required destroying the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, seizing Southeast Asia's resources, and establishing a defensive perimeter so strong that America would exhaust itself trying to breach it. It was a desperately optimistic gamble based on several questionable assumptions. First, it assumed that the psychological shock of Pearl Harbor would intimidate rather than enrage the American public. Second, it assumed that Americans facing a costly island-hopping campaign across the Pacific would lose the will to fight and accept Japanese dominance in East Asia. Third, it assumed that Japan could establish and maintain a defensive perimeter across the vast Pacific, while also prosecuting a ground war in China and defending against any Soviet threat from the north. Fourth, it assumed that Germany would win in Europe, forcing Britain to make peace and preventing America from committing its full resources to the Pacific. And finally, it assumed that Japan's initial qualitative superiority in naval aviation and trained personnel would be decisive before America's quantitative advantages could be brought to bear. Yamamoto understood that every one of these assumptions was questionable at best, but he was a military officer, and when his civilian leaders decided on war, his duty was to devise the best possible strategy for achieving victory, however unlikely. In the months leading up to Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto spent countless hours refining the attack plan. The operation was breathtakingly ambitious. 6 aircraft carriers would sail across 3,400 miles of ocean, maintain complete radio silence, avoid detection by American patrols, and launch a surprise attack on a Sunday morning when most of the Pacific Fleet was in port. The planning was meticulous. Pilots trained for months on mock-ups of Pearl Harbor. Special armor-piercing bombs were developed from 16-inch naval shells to penetrate battleship armor. Torpedo fins were modified to work in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Weather reports were analyzed, American routines were studied, and contingency plans were developed for dozens of scenarios. Yamamoto knew the attack had to be devastating and complete. Half measures would only alert America without crippling its capacity to respond. The primary targets were the American aircraft carriers, but intelligence indicated that these vessels would likely be at sea during the attack. The secondary targets were battleships and shore installations. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, achieved tactical surprise and inflicted severe damage on the Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships were damaged or sunk, 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers were damaged, and 188 aircraft were destroyed. About 2,400 Americans were killed, and 1,200 wounded. From a tactical standpoint, the attack was a brilliant success. But from a strategic standpoint, it was deeply flawed. The American aircraft carriers were not in port, and escaped unscathed. The vast fuel storage facilities at Pearl Harbor were not targeted, and remained intact, as did the shipyards and repair facilities that would prove crucial in the coming months. Most of the battleships sunk in the shallow harbor were later raised and repaired, eventually rejoining the fleet. And most critically, the attack unified the previously divided American public behind a total war effort. The next day, President Franklin Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress voted for war with only one dissenting vote. Yamamoto's fears about awakening the sleeping giant had been realized. In the 6 months following Pearl Harbor, Japan achieved a string of victories that stunned the world. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma all fell to Japanese forces. The British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse were sunk by Japanese aircraft, vindicating Yamamoto's theories about the vulnerability of capital ships to air attack. By May 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, encompassing the resource-rich territories that had been the objective of the war. Yamamoto's prediction about running wild for 6 months had proven accurate, but he took no pleasure in these victories. He knew they were ephemeral, bought at a cost Japan could not afford, while America was only beginning to mobilize its vast resources. He understood that every Japanese carrier, every trained pilot, every cruiser and destroyer lost was irreplaceable in any meaningful time frame, while American losses would be made good and multiplied. He had given Japan its 6 months. Now came the reckoning he had dreaded. The turning point came sooner than even Yamamoto expected. In June 1942, barely 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese and American fleets met at the Battle of Midway, a small atoll in the Central Pacific that Japan targeted as the next step in expanding its defensive perimeter. Yamamoto planned a complex operation involving multiple fleet elements, hoping to lure the American carriers into a trap and destroy them. But American codebreakers had partially decrypted Japanese naval communications and knew the attack was coming. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, positioned his carriers to ambush the Japanese. The battle was decided in 5 minutes on the morning of June 4th, when American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese carriers with their decks full of armed and fueled aircraft. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were hit and set ablaze. A 4th carrier, Hiyeiu, was sunk later that day. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, and about 3,000 men, including many of its most experienced pilots. American losses were 1 carrier, a destroyer, and about 300 men. Midway was a catastrophe for Japan from which the nation would never recover. The loss of 4 carriers was bad enough, but the loss of trained pilots, maintenance crews, and combat experience was irreplaceable. Japan's naval aviation had entered the war with perhaps the best trained pilots in the world, men who had hundreds of hours of flight time and years of training, but the Japanese training system could not replace losses at the rate they were accumulating. American pilots, while perhaps initially less skilled, were produced in far greater numbers, and their training continuously improved as combat experience was integrated into instruction. By late 1942, the qualitative gap had narrowed considerably, and the quantitative advantage was overwhelmingly in America's favor. Yamamoto had warned that Japan could not sustain a war of attrition, and Midway proved him right. The 6 months he had promised were over. Japan would win no more significant victories. From Midway onward, the war became a slow, grinding, inevitable Japanese retreat, as American industrial might produced an unstoppable flood of ships, aircraft, and trained personnel. In August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning a 6-month campaign that became a microcosm of the Pacific War. The Japanese fought with fanatical determination, pouring reinforcements and supplies into the island. The naval battles around Guadalcanal were among the most ferocious of the war, with both sides suffering heavy losses, but the crucial difference was that America could afford the losses and Japan could not. For every American ship sunk, 2 more were being built. For every American aircraft destroyed, 5 more rolled off production lines. For every American pilot killed, 10 more completed training. Japan's losses were permanent. By February 1943, Japan evacuated Guadalcanal, having lost 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 11 destroyers, 6 submarines, and hundreds of aircraft, along with thousands of irreplaceable trained personnel. American losses were also heavy, but replacements were already arriving. Yamamoto understood exactly what Guadalcanal meant. Japan had lost the war of attrition he had always feared. Victory was now impossible. The only question was how long defeat could be delayed, and at what cost. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, Yamamoto continued to devise operations aimed at inflicting maximum casualties on American forces, hoping that heavy losses might still persuade the United States to negotiate. But he was under no illusions. In private conversations with his staff, he expressed pessimism about Japan's prospects. He was frustrated by the Army's refusal to acknowledge strategic realities and by the government's failure to seek a diplomatic solution, while Japan still held some bargaining chips. He believed that Japan should attempt to negotiate peace from its position of maximum expansion in mid-1942, but such views were considered defeatist by the militarists who dominated Japanese politics. The government's official position was that Japan would fight to the bitter end rather than accept the humiliation of surrender. Yamamoto, who had opposed the war from the beginning, was now trapped in a conflict he knew was unwinnable, bound by honor and duty to fight on. It was a deeply tragic position for a man whose strategic foresight had proven so accurate, but whose warnings had been so thoroughly ignored. In April 1943, Yamamoto planned an inspection tour of Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands to boost morale among frontline units. His itinerary was transmitted by encrypted radio, but American codebreakers decrypted the message and learned that Yamamoto would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville on the morning of April 18th. The Americans saw an opportunity to kill the architect of Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nimitz authorized Operation Vengeance, a long-range interception mission by P-38 Lightning fighters from Guadalcanal. The decision to target Yamamoto was controversial, as killing an enemy commander through intelligence gained from code-breaking might alert Japan that its codes were compromised. But the opportunity to eliminate Japan's most capable naval strategist was deemed worth the risk. President Roosevelt personally approved the mission. On the morning of April 18, 1943, 18 P-38 Lightnings took off from Guadalcanal and flew 435 miles at wave-top height to avoid detection. They arrived precisely as Yamamoto's transport aircraft approached Bougainville, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The Americans attacked, and in the brief dogfight that followed, Yamamoto's bomber was hit and crashed into the jungle. Search parties later found Yamamoto's body still strapped in his seat, killed by bullets that struck him in the left shoulder and head. He was 59 years old. The man who had warned Japan not to fight America, who had predicted that Japan could only run wild for 6 months, who had understood that industrial might would determine the war's outcome, was dead. Ironically, his death came almost exactly 6 months after the Battle of Midway, the battle that confirmed his predictions. News of Yamamoto's death was a severe blow to Japanese morale. He had been the nation's most respected military leader, and his loss was irreplaceable. The Japanese government held a state funeral, and Yamamoto was posthumously promoted to the rank of Fleet Admiral, the highest rank in the Japanese Navy. But his death changed nothing strategically. The war continued on the trajectory he had foreseen. American forces advanced across the Pacific, capturing island after island, each one bringing them closer to Japan itself. In the 2 years following Yamamoto's death, the war unfolded exactly as he had predicted. American industrial production reached staggering levels. In 1943 to 1944, American shipyards launched more than 100 aircraft carriers of various types, along with dozens of battleships, cruisers, and hundreds of destroyers and submarines. By 1945, the U.S. Navy was larger than all other navies in the world combined. Aircraft production reached heights that Japanese planners had considered impossible. In 1944 alone, the United States produced more than 96,000 aircraft, while Japan's entire war production was about 76,000 aircraft from 1941 to 1945. The disparity extended to every category of war material. American factories produced over 300,000 aircraft during the war, compared to Japan's 76,000. The US built 88,000 tanks to Japan's 6,300. American shipyards launched 5,200 major warships and 65,000 landing craft, while Japan managed about 700 warships. The sheer scale of American production would have seemed like science fiction to someone in 1941, but it was exactly what Yamamoto had warned about. The human cost of ignoring Yamamoto's warnings was catastrophic. By 1944, Japan was losing trained pilots faster than they could be replaced, leading to the desperate tactic of kamikaze attacks, in which pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into American ships. While kamikazes inflicted significant casualties, they were a strategy born of desperation, not strength. Japan's merchant marine was systematically destroyed by American submarines, cutting off the very resources that Japan had gone to war to secure. By 1945, Japan was starving, its cities reduced to ash by American firebombing, its navy destroyed, its air force grounded by lack of fuel. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 finally forced Japan's surrender, but the nation was already defeated, its industrial capacity destroyed, its empire lost, its people suffering. The total death toll of the Pacific War exceeded 30 million people, with Japan suffering approximately 3 million dead. It was the catastrophe Yamamoto had foreseen and tried to prevent. Why were Yamamoto's warnings ignored? The answer lies in a combination of institutional culture, political ideology, and psychological factors that afflicted Japanese leadership in the 1930s and early 1940s. First, there was a deep cultural bias within the Japanese military that emphasized spirit and willpower over material factors. The concept of Yamato Damashi, or Japanese spirit, held that determination and sacrifice could overcome material disadvantages. This belief was reinforced by Japan's victory over Russia in 1905, when a supposedly inferior Asian power had defeated a European great power through superior morale and tactics. Japanese military education emphasized historical examples of smaller forces defeating larger ones through superior spirit. This made it psychologically difficult for many officers to accept that material factors might be decisive. Second, there was a strong current of racial thinking in Japanese military circles. Many officers believed that Japanese racial and cultural characteristics made them superior warriors compared to soft, individualistic Westerners. Americans in particular were seen as weak, decadent, and lacking the stomach for a hard fight. Third, the institutional structure of Japanese decision-making was dysfunctional. The Army and Navy operated as separate fiefdoms with minimal coordination and often conflicting objectives. Civilian government had been largely sidelined by the mid-1930s, with military officers holding veto power over cabinet appointments and policy decisions. There was no equivalent to the Western concept of civilian control over the military. This meant that strategic decisions were often made by consensus among military leaders, with dissenting voices marginalized. Officers who expressed doubts about war plans were considered unpatriotic or cowardly. Yamamoto's warnings were unwelcome because they contradicted the prevailing consensus that Japan could achieve its objectives through military action. Fourth, there was a cognitive bias toward optimism in Japanese planning. War games and strategic assessments consistently assumed that Japanese forces would perform better than realistic expectations suggested, while American responses were assumed to be slower and less effective than likely. When American actions exceeded Japanese expectations, as they consistently did, Japanese planners attributed this to bad luck or intelligence failures rather than flawed assumptions. Fifth, by 1941, Japan had painted itself into a corner diplomatically and economically. The oil embargo meant that Japan's military would become progressively weaker as stockpiles were depleted. From the perspective of military planners, war now was preferable to war later when Japan would be even weaker. This created a use-it-or-lose-it mentality regarding military force. The idea of diplomatic retreat was psychologically unacceptable to leaders who had staked their careers and reputations on the China War and Southern expansion. Finally, there was a fundamental misunderstanding of American political culture and decision-making. Japanese leaders believed that Americans, being individualistic and materialistic, would not accept heavy casualties for abstract principles or distant territories. They thought that a string of early defeats would lead to public pressure for a negotiated peace. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. Americans could indeed be isolationist and reluctant to enter foreign wars, but once committed, they proved far more determined than Japanese planners anticipated. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, rather than intimidating America, unified the country behind total war. Yamamoto understood all of these factors because of his unique background. His time in America had given him insights that few of his colleagues possessed. He had seen American society from the inside, studied its economy, and understood its political system. He recognized that American democracy, while messy and slow to mobilize, possessed enormous resilience and adaptability once committed to a course of action. He understood that American industrial capacity was built on a foundation of natural resources, advanced technology, and efficient organization that Japan could not match. And perhaps most importantly, he understood that Americans would view Pearl Harbor not as a reason to seek peace, but as an act of treachery demanding retribution. His warnings were ignored, not because they were wrong, but because they were psychologically and politically unacceptable to leaders committed to a path of expansion and confrontation. Acknowledging Yamamoto's analysis would have required admitting that the entire strategic direction of the 1930s had been a mistake, that the China War was unwinnable, and that Japan's ambitions exceeded its means. No government willingly admits such fundamental errors. The tragedy of Yamamoto is that he was a brilliant tactician forced to implement a fundamentally flawed strategy. He designed and executed Pearl Harbor not because he believed it would win the war, but because he believed it was Japan's only chance to avoid complete disaster. His plan was to shock America into negotiations by destroying the Pacific Fleet, then using the breathing space to consolidate Japan's conquests and establish such a strong defensive position that America would conclude that dislodging Japan was too costly. It was a long shot at best, requiring multiple improbable assumptions to prove correct. Yamamoto knew this. His famous statement about running wild for 6 months was not boastful confidence, but tragic resignation. He was telling his political masters that he could buy them 6 months with brilliant tactics, but after that, strategic realities would assert themselves. He was both right and optimistic. Japanese expansion lasted about 6 months, until Midway. After Midway, every major engagement was an American victory or a draw that favored America's greater resources. There is a profound irony in Yamamoto's fate. He was killed by the American military machine he had so accurately assessed, using technologies and capabilities that validated his understanding of American strengths. The P-38 fighters that shot him down were products of American aviation industry, flying a mission enabled by American code-breaking capabilities, navigating with precision across hundreds of miles of ocean, exactly the kind of technical and industrial achievement Yamamoto had warned about. His death came at the hands of the very system he had tried to tell Japanese leaders they could not defeat. In a broader sense, Yamamoto's story illustrates the limits of individual brilliance in the face of structural realities. He was arguably Japan's most capable naval officer, a man of vision who understood aviation warfare before most of his contemporaries, and a strategic thinker who accurately assessed the balance of power between Japan and America. Yet none of this mattered because he operated within a system that could not accept his conclusions. His brilliance allowed him to inflict spectacular tactical defeats on America in the war's early months, but could not overcome the fundamental disparity in resources and industrial capacity that made Japan's defeat inevitable. The question remains, could anything have been done differently? If Japanese leaders had heeded Yamamoto's warnings, could disaster have been avoided? The answer is complex. By 1941, Japan's options were severely constrained by previous decisions. The war in China had become a quagmire, consuming resources and international goodwill without achieving decisive results. The alliance with Germany had alienated Western powers and linked Japan to a European conflict that was not in its interest. The occupation of French Indochina had triggered American economic sanctions that threatened Japan's survival. At this point, the choices were to accept diplomatic humiliation by withdrawing from China and Indochina, or to gamble on war. A third option, negotiating seriously with the United States while making genuine concessions, might have prevented war, but this would have required abandoning the core objectives that had driven Japanese policy for a decade. It would have meant admitting that Japan's expansion had been a costly mistake. No government in any country finds such admissions easy, and the militaristic, honor-bound culture of 1940s Japan made it virtually impossible. However, earlier in the 1930s, different choices might have led to different outcomes. If Japan had consolidated its position in Manchuria without invading China proper, if it had maintained better relations with Western powers, if it had focused on economic development rather than military expansion, the catastrophe of 1941 to 1945 might have been avoided. But these alternative paths would have required different leadership with different values and priorities. The officers who drove Japanese policy in the 1930s were products of a military culture that valued territorial expansion, viewed compromise as weakness, and believed in the ultimate efficacy of military force. Yamamoto himself was part of this culture, even as he challenged some of its assumptions. He did not oppose Japanese imperialism or militarism in principle. He simply understood that Japan lacked the resources to fight America. Had he believed Japan could win such a war, he would likely have supported it. His opposition was pragmatic, not principled. This makes his warnings more credible, not less. He was not a pacifist or an idealist, but a hard-headed military professional who understood the correlation of forces. In the decades since World War II, Yamamoto's reputation has been the subject of considerable debate. In Japan, he is often viewed sympathetically as a tragic figure who understood Japan's limitations but was powerless to prevent disaster. Some portray him as having opposed the war on moral grounds, though the evidence suggests his opposition was strategic rather than ethical. In the United States, he is remembered as the architect of Pearl Harbor, a brilliant enemy who inflicted a devastating surprise attack, but was ultimately defeated by the industrial and military might. Some American accounts portray him almost with admiration as a worthy adversary who understood America better than his colleagues and fought with honor. The truth is complex. Yamamoto was a highly capable officer who served a militaristic, aggressive regime. He planned and executed operations that killed thousands of Allied servicemen. His understanding of strategic realities does not absolve him of responsibility for his actions. Yet he also tried to prevent a war he knew would be catastrophic, and when ordered to fight, he did his duty despite his convictions that the cause was doomed. The lessons of Yamamoto's story extend beyond World War II. His experience illustrates several enduring truths about war, strategy, and political decision-making. First, accurate strategic assessment requires intellectual honesty and willingness to accept uncomfortable truths. Yamamoto's understanding of America was based on direct observation and careful analysis, not on wishful thinking or ideological preconceptions. Most of his colleagues lacked this foundation and defaulted to assumptions that confirmed their existing beliefs. Second, material factors matter enormously in modern warfare. Superior spirit, training, and tactics can achieve tactical victories, but in a prolonged conflict, industrial capacity, resource availability, and population size tend to be decisive. This was true in World War II, and remains true today, though technology has somewhat complicated the equation. Third, strategic decisions are path-dependent. By 1941, Japan's choices were constrained by previous decisions made in the 1930s. Avoiding war might have required different choices years earlier. Once committed to a certain path, changing direction becomes progressively more difficult. Fourth, institutional culture shapes strategic assessment. The Japanese military's emphasis on spirit over material, its racial assumptions, and its dysfunctional decision-making structure all contributed to ignoring Yamamoto's warnings. Organizations tend to dismiss information that contradicts their operating assumptions, even when that information comes from credible sources. Fifth, the gap between tactical and strategic success can be enormous. Japan won spectacular tactical victories in the war's first 6 months, but was strategically doomed from the start. Tactical brilliance cannot compensate for strategic insolvency. And finally, individual brilliance has limits. Yamamoto was perhaps the most capable Japanese naval officer of his generation, but he could not overcome the structural weaknesses of Japan's position or the psychological limitations of his country's leadership. His story is a reminder that systemic problems require systemic solutions, and that even the most capable individuals cannot single-handedly redirect nations committed to disastrous courses. Today, Yamamoto's story resonates because the dynamics he confronted remain relevant. Nations still sometimes embark on conflicts without fully assessing the long-term requirements for success. Leaders still sometimes dismiss warnings that contradict preferred policies. Strategic planning still sometimes emphasizes optimistic scenarios while downplaying risks. And institutional cultures still sometimes privilege ideology or wishful thinking over hard-headed analysis. The specifics change, but the underlying patterns persist. Yamamoto's great insight was understanding that war is ultimately a contest of resources and will, and that tactical brilliance cannot indefinitely compensate for strategic disadvantage. He saw clearly what many of his contemporaries refused to acknowledge, that Japan could not win a long war against the United States, because the disparity in industrial capacity and resources was simply too great. His tragedy was being proven right in a way that cost millions of lives and destroyed his country. His legacy is a cautionary tale about the importance of accurate strategic assessment and the catastrophic consequences when leaders ignore unwelcome truths. In conclusion, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto knew Japan couldn't win a long war against the United States because he had done something few of his colleagues had. He had studied America firsthand, analyzed its industrial capacity objectively, and understood its national character realistically. His warnings were clear, specific, and accurate. He told Japanese leaders they could expect early tactical successes, but inevitable strategic defeat. He explained that American industrial production would overwhelm Japan's capacity to replace losses. He predicted that American resolve, once aroused, would not accept a negotiated peace, but would demand total victory. Every one of these predictions proved correct. The tragedy is that his warnings were ignored by leaders who could not accept their implications. The even greater tragedy is that millions paid with their lives for this failure of strategic judgment. Yamamoto's story stands as one of history's clearest examples of the catastrophic consequences when political and military leaders refuse to confront uncomfortable strategic realities. His brilliance illuminated the path to disaster, but he was powerless to prevent it. In the end, he became both prophet and victim of the catastrophe he had foreseen, killed in action while prosecuting a war he had always known Japan would lose. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share.